Hello YouTube, this is Mr. Gibson Guy, and thanks for tuning in again. I'm giving you a new video today, and this is, we'll entitle it Minolta XD versus Canon A1. May the best camera lose. That's the subtitle. Wow. So what is the importance here? We have two old cameras, two cameras that were direct competitors in their day, and fought it out in the trenches of photography. But these two cameras here are very pertinent to the cameras that you use today. You see, this was where it all started, so to speak, in automation, in making cameras smart. The Canon A-1 and the Minolta XD-11 are both what we called at the time multi-mode program cameras. Now what that means in plain terms is that when you had one of these two cameras, you were the photographer. You were responsible for focusing the lens on the subject and pushing the shutter button. Focus and shoot. That's what the photographer had to do. All the rest of it was taken up by the camera. The camera took the responsibility for everything. Now, cameras didn't start out that way, but these two cameras represented what happened in the world of photography that brought us to where you are now. Let's take a look at how all this stuff happened. Start at the beginning, right? Good place to start. That's a motor drive. I'll move that back. All right, so in the 1960s, cameras were big and heavy and indestructible. These things, you could hammer nails with them. This happens to be a Nikkor mat. And also, along the lines of that, cameras started to become a real pain in the neck. In 1971, Nikon introduced the F2. Got to move everybody over here. This is an F2A here, a later model, but this was one of the very first ones. This was one of the last ones from '79. And this was the state of the art in 1971. But then something very, very unexpected came about. Recognize that? That is the Canon, or not, sorry, Canon, the Olympus OM1. We got it in there. You get a little bit of a comparison of the size of these two cameras. When you see that, it's a lot bigger and a lot heavier. These things were a real pain in the neck. But in the early 70s, that was the state of the art. And then Olympus came out with this. A small Japanese company introduced a revolutionary idea, the Olympus M1, which became the OM1. And it was a scaled down, lightweight camera that changed the equation. And soon all the other makers went on a downsizing binge because they had to keep up with this. Believe it or not, when people saw this, they no longer wanted to carry these things around. I can understand why. So this started a change in everything. And one of the camera makers, Olympus, they saw the OM1 and they saw, well, it's manufactured the same way as the older cameras and it's built the same way as the older cameras. It's just small, which means it's harder to build, which means it's rougher on the employees. And okay, so could there be a different way? If Olympus can go from nowhere to being really successful with their OM1 in the early 70s, what could a big company like Canon do? And Canon decided that they were going to really take a big step, and they were going to change the world of photography or go bust doing it. And so Canon had a much bigger idea. And the Canon plan was, first of all, they were going to use recent advancements in auto exposure systems. And Canon embarked on setting up a design that would simplify the camera's operation, that made it simpler for the user to be successful with. Up until that time, most people's familiarity with cameras and film and photography was an Instamatic, which was a little unfocused camera that had a fixed focal length lens and a little film cassette that you put in it, and maybe a flash cube on top of the camera if you used it at night. And it had one exposure, one focus, and your pictures generally came out pretty weak. And so when Canon decided they were going to devise an auto exposure camera that was going to be accessible to the masses, that was a really remarkable idea. And they backed it up with the other necessary ideas that went with it. In addition to designing a easy-to-use, successful camera, they also used plastics in place of metal, electronics in replace of mechanics, and made cameras that were, one, much lighter, if not any smaller, but lighter, and significantly easier to manufacture. So they could set up a big manufacturing facility and hire a lot of people that were not very skilled, and with all these cameras that had circuit boards inside of them and everything, they could develop a camera which was very easy to make, very reliable, long-term reliability, and inexpensive. The result was, oh, and wait, I can't read the result yet. There was also one other factor, and that was number 3, a huge advertising campaign to bring in more customers for these easy-to-use cameras. The result was the first camera to utilize a CPU, central processing unit, the first primitive computer, and it was the Canon AE-1, first introduced in April of 1976. I'm going to take the Olympus away, and we'll put a Canon up here. There we go, Canon. Now, this is a series. I'm showing you an A1 right now because that's the only Canon that I have. But we started out with the AE1 program in 1976, the camera with the first CPU. All the rest of these cameras were going to be based on the AE1. The AE1 was a shutter speed priority where the user set the shutter speed and the camera set the aperture. The camera selected the aperture automatically and set it to that at the time of the picture. In December of '76, they introduced the AT1, which was a manual match needle camera, like the Olympus OM1, where there was a needle that went up and down, and you followed the aperture ring and the shutter speed ring to get it centered, on the needle centered on the indicator, and then you had proper exposure. But remember, all of the Canon A-series cameras were all electronic. So unlike the OM1 or the Nikon Mat or the Nikon F2, which had manual shutter speeds, this was all electronically controlled. It didn't have the gears in it, didn't have all that stuff. And so it was the only known manual camera that was all electronic. But that was Canon's idea. Then in April of '78, 2 years after the initial AE1, Canon introduced, ta-da, the A1, which was their flagship model. A year and a month later, in May of 1979, they introduced the AV1, which was the complement to the AE1. The AE1 was the one that was shutter speed priority, where you set the shutter speed and the camera chose the aperture. The AV1 was the one where you set the aperture and the camera chose the shutter speed, which happens to be the same system that most all the other companies' auto exposure cameras were using. And then in April of 1981, which was 5 years after the AE1 first appeared, Canon introduced the AE1 program, which introduced a similar program mode to what originally they had in the A1, the one we're looking at here. And then finally, last but not least, and little known, it only lasted about a year and gave a hint of what was to come, the last of the A-series cameras was the AL1, which appeared in March of 1982, and 11 months after the AE1 program. And the AL1 was similar to an AE1 that had focus confirmation built into the camera. It did not autofocus, but it assessed your focusing and gave you an arrow up and down indication as to where the correct focus should be according to the camera. So that was kind of a lead in into autofocus, which was something that was going to require different lenses than what people had. All right, so that was the whole line of A-series cameras, and need I mention, with all the advertising budget and everything that Canon was doing, that the AE1, which ran for 8.5 years, 9 years, about, Canon produced about 6.5 million of those cameras during that time. So they made a lot of cameras. Up until that time, probably total Canon's camera sales, total camera sales of 35mm cameras around the world was maybe 100,000 or something like that. Something lower probably. But Canon made 6.5 million AE1s. And of all the A-series, I don't know what the figure is. It'll be much higher than that. But they had a big success with that camera. Now, where am I? Oh, yes, in addition to the advertising, Canon, along with Minolta, promoted selling their cameras in department stores. And soon, Sears and Roebuck, JCPenney, and even Kmart had opened camera departments in all of their department stores. So it used to be, if you went to a big city, there was a camera shop there where you could buy cameras. But if you lived out in the suburbs and out in towns and out and about other areas, you wouldn't find cameras anywhere. They just weren't out there. But with this new marketing scheme that Canon and Minolta especially had hatched up to bring in lots of new photographers, which obviously they did, they had to get the cameras where the public could get them. So instead of having to go to New York City or Los Angeles to get a camera, you could get it at the JCPenney in the mall or at the local Kmart. They, of course, started carrying other cameras too. But Canon had the head start on the mass production and the plastic and use of electronics, and they redefined the cameras with that. So let's see what happened. In 1977, 1 year after Canon introduced the AE1 we talked about, Minolta released their new compact flagship model. That was the XD-11. This was an electric camera with a mechanical shutter speed. Just one. One of the speeds was mechanical. But it still kept mechanical shutter, so in case the batteries die, you still could take a picture. That shutter speed happened to be 1/100th of a second, which was also the X-Sync speed for electronic flash. We'll talk about that more a little bit later. This camera featured shutter priority and aperture priority auto exposure as well as manual. Also, it had a vertical travel metal bladed shutter which synced at 1/100th of a second. The camera was also sold to Leica and was turned into the R4, the R5, and the R6 reflex series of Leica cameras, which were based on the XD-11. In 1978, 1 year later, Canon introduced the A1, which was aimed squarely at the XD-11. Like, yep, aimed squarely at the XD-11. Like the rest of the Canon A series camera, the top of the line camera had a molded plastic top plate, many nylon and plastic components. There were no mechanical shutter speeds. The A1 had a horizontally traveling cloth shutter curtain, similar to what most cameras were using at the time, and a sync speed of 1/60th of a second, almost a whole stop slower than the XD-11. The A1 was designed to be made efficiently. It was inexpensive to make, and it took not very skilled people to do it, as opposed to trying to make a miniaturized OM1, which really was a challenge. Like the XD, the A1 had a very similar controls for shutter priority, aperture priority, and manual exposure. Let's see here. On this one, we have a three-way selector right there, shutter, aperture, and manual. On this one, we have two ways here, aperture and shutter, and then manual. And if you watch in here, see if we can see this. Ah, there we go. Goes to shutter speeds. Or we can switch it back and it gives apertures. See that? So they have that as to how you set up which system of auto exposure you wanted to use. We'll look at some more close-ups of these too. The A1 was the first multi-mode camera to feature programmed auto exposure when the camera selects the shutter speed and the aperture automatically, what we were talking about at the very beginning of this video. It must be noted that Canon was the first maker to advertise their, quote, programmed camera. The XD actually had the first system to allow the camera to set both shutter speed and aperture. The early XDs had what Minolta called final check, where the camera corrected both shutter speed and aperture at the moment of exposure. On later models, the shutter speed dial featured a green 1/25th right there, which is white on this because this is an early one, but you'll see on the newer ones that the 125 is green on that shutter dial. So you set that to green, and you can see the S is green like that, and F16 is green right there. So green, that was called green for go, and what that was everything set to green. The camera would program itself based on your settings and correcting what needed to be corrected. The non-program mode of the Minolta XD was actually a lot more successful than the regular program mode of the A1, because that was made just to be programmed, and the Minolta system actually was more, it preferred, the more important was a faster shutter speed than a smaller aperture, because it was trying to keep you from getting blurred photos from camera movement. So it accentuated the shutter speed being a safe shutter speed to hand hold rather than combining shutter speeds and apertures for the program. So it ended up being a better program even though they didn't call it a program. All right. Canon A-1 was the first camera with red LED alphanumeric readout. The Minolta featured a full information finder and readout with rotating aperture and shutter speed screens. So inside the eyepiece here, you had a shutter speed scale with LEDs, and you had an aperture scale. One or the other, depending on which setting you set this to, showed whether the camera was selecting the shutter speed or the apertures. So you had those both in sight, plus the reading off the lens here of the f-stop, and what speed your shutter speed dial would have been set to. All of that is read inside there, so you have full information. The Canon red letters and numbers in LEDs is really cool looking. But the downside of it is that it really chewed through batteries pretty fast. You've got to keep the batteries turned off on this one. When I do an exposure in a minute and show you the sound of it, you're going to see you got to make sure you turn it on and click the shutter a couple of times, and then you turn it back off again, because you don't want to leave it running because it'll run your batteries down. On the Minolta it doesn't matter, you don't have to have the batteries. It'll click anyway. Alright, so okay, in operation the Minolta is quiet and silky smooth in shutter speed, in shutter action, and in the film take-up. The Canon is rather clunky and plastic. So I'm supposed to do some demonstrations here. I'll start with the Minolta here, and let's see. So you can hear just what it sounds like to the photographer here. Yeah, listen. Very quiet. This is right by the camera, as you can see. By contrast, let's hear the Nichromat shutter. Alright, just a little bit louder, very similar to what the Minolta sounds like. And, oh, the big one here, F2, sorry, F3's on the shelf. Oh, this one's a little louder here. Got kind of a ring to it. Hear that? I kind of like the sound of the Nichromat better than the Nikon F2. One more time on the Minolta. Quiet. Very subdued. Yeah, it's got a lot of shock absorber for that mirror, so it doesn't go clank clank. Now, the Canon. We got to turn it on here. Put this to A. And turn this switch over here. Let's see. Oh, yeah, you can kind of see where the red LED is inside there. All right. That's an interesting sound. Oh. All right, better get light here. Kind of sounds clunky, doesn't it? I will point out, so all of you people know this in case you missed this, but the Canon A1s nowadays, being 40 years old, they have a reputation for a shutter whine that kind of sounds like a little motor drive thing when you just press the button and shutter and then wind the film with the regular thumb knob, but it's actually not endemic to the camera. It means that the camera shutter mechanism, the shock absorber in it, is dried out and it needs some oil. This one's oiled. When I first got it, it was it would make all those whiny noises when you use it. And I've seen a bunch of people do A1 videos where their camera is singing the same song, because all the A1s do it when they dry out. But one guy made a video about how you take the bottom off and you go up inside there, you put in a drop of oil, and then you cycle it a few times, and the sound goes away. That sound wasn't heard on mine because I did that. It's lubricated, and that's all it takes. And I think if you're running the camera when it needs lubrication and not lubricating it, your camera's probably not going to last very long. So take a look for that one. That's a good one to know. All right, so, body weight, yes. How about this? Now, these are not exactly the same because the Canon has an f1.8 50mm, and the Minolta has an f1.4, which is a really great lens. Let me go with this one first. Got a button here, press. Here's what this lens sounds like. And the 50mm 1.4 on the Minolta. This is a big guy here. Oh, listen to that. Oh, plastic, glass and brass. This is really light. This, you can feel the heft to it. It's easily twice the weight of this one. It's got a lot of plastic in it. And I can tell you, I know there's a lot of plastic inside these FD lenses here. This camera, pretty lightweight. This one, it's just maybe an ounce heavier. It's just, you can see the camera body is bigger for this. Let's see. You see this? Yeah. The Minolta is just a little bit less across than the Canon is. Canon is a little bit higher at the top plate than the Minolta, a little bit higher in the pen prism. Almost the exact same width on them, just slightly heavier. The Canon definitely wins when it comes to the cool motor drive. This thing is awesome, and this battery compartment takes 12, not 8, 12 AA's. That means that, see, 8 AA's is 12 volts. That makes this 16 volt. Yeah, 16 volt. 16 volt motor, and you have your speeds. You can set it for high, low, off, and single S. These are, so definitely the coolest motor drive around. Not that anybody goes burning through film like that, but if you wanted to, you could burn it really fast there. So let's wrap up here. These cameras were direct competitors. Overall, the Minolta was clearly the better camera, but the Canon really won the image contest. The Minolta was simple and straightforward, while the Canon was the bad boy. And it's true, the Canon A-1 was a profoundly popular camera, and everybody thought it just gave them a really cool image. And the Minolta XD was a very competent camera, but it was kind of expensive and didn't deliver the excitement of the A1, but it certainly delivered a lot of competence. It was much more refined, but didn't really get off the ground. And ironically, I'll finish up with this part, ironically the XD could have been the top camera of the 1970s, top professional camera of the 1970s. But Minolta unwittingly handed their winning ticket to Olympus right at the start of the race. Now, if you've seen my other video, you know that I mention this, and not too many other people point this out on YouTube. But in the early 70s, Minolta engineers had, you line up the red with the red, had been working on developing a metering system in the camera, which included a light meter in the pentaprism and then another light meter. Can't show you here, but in the mirror box. I can show you on that one, couldn't I? It's an OM1. An OM1. Pop the lens off, and you can use this to flip up the mirror. And you can't see much in there because it's dark, but inside the mirror box they have a little, not on the one, but on the two, there's another light meter off on the side that faces the film plane towards the shutter curtain. And with that shutter curtain, with that other light meter, what it's supposed to be doing is measuring the light off the film at the time of exposure. And Minolta early on researched that and developed a system, but then they said, well, what good is it? What are we going to use that for? Who needs to measure the light during exposure? And so they never went anywhere with it, although they could have. And somehow the word got back to Olympus in the early 70s that Minolta was trying this new thing, and they had patented it. So Maitani or somebody from Olympus went to Minolta and said, you know, this new patent you got, we want to use it. And they said, knock yourself out. So they licensed them a 4 or 5 year agreement to have exclusive use of this this metering system. And you see, Olympus thought beyond the Minolta people. That's why I think it was Maitani, because he came up with all the genius ideas. And he said, measuring off the film plane is totally worthless for regular photography, but priceless for flash photography, because that means that we are now measuring the flash output directly at the film, so we can get really accurate flash exposures. And so they licensed that, and when they came out with their automatic exposure camera, the OM2, they included Minolta's patent exclusively for the next 5 years to have that only in Olympus cameras. And if Minolta had only finished developing and applied that to the XD-11, and it never went to an OM1, then the whole world of photography would have been very changed, because the Minolta would have been the king of the hill in the late 70s instead of Olympus, using Minolta's patent. Ironic. So, if you enjoyed this video, you learned something useful, or you just like looking at these cool cameras, then give me a thumbs up. Leave me a comment on what you think about what I said. Tell me your stories about your XD-11s or your A1s or your other cameras. And I wouldn't mind if you subscribe to the channel if you're not subscribed already. But thanks for sticking with it, and I'll see you in the next one. This is Mr. Gibson Guy out.